Good evening, and welcome to the Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen Center for Thought and Culture. Our mission is to highlight the true, the good, and the beautiful as they have been expressed throughout the ages, and to deepen, explore, and challenge ourselves, Catholic and non-Catholic alike, intellectually, artistically, and spiritually. Thank you for joining us this evening for Race in America, Telling Our Stories, an evening with esteemed writers Sapphire, Major Jackson, and Patrick Phillips. James Baldwin once said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." This evening, through poetry and prose, fact and fiction, beauty and brutality, Sapphire, Major, and Patrick will present work that faces the difficult questions about race in America. While some of what will be presented this evening may be challenging and uncomfortable to hear, the dialogue that it generates will hopefully promote a better understanding of ourselves with an eye on how to move forward and heal. Our first speaker, Sapphire, is known for her powerful explorations of cycles of violence in the lives of men, women, and children. She will present a variety of selections from her work as a poet and novelist. Next, Major Jackson will share selections from Roll Deep, his collection of poetry meditating on the place and power of Black male bodies moving through the world. Finally, Patrick Phillips will share passages from his book, Blood at the Root, A Racial Cleansing in America, which uses the history of Forsyth, Georgia, to trace the psychological impact of slavery on both white and Black residents, leading to Forsyth's racial cleansing of 1912 and continued systemic racism today. After the presentations, all three artists will engage in conversation about the current status of race relations in America and how we can move forward together as a country. We look forward to hearing your questions during that conversation. Now please welcome poet and novelist Sapphire to the stage.
I'm going to read a poem, but before I do that, I'm going to read a response to an op-ed. After the movie Precious came out, the New York Times ran an op-ed by a self-proclaimed cultural Black nationalist attacking the film, a man who had always been vitriolic about the persecution of the Black man by the white man, bitterly protested the intersectionality of a film that dealt with racism, homophobia, sexism, colorism, and incest, among other things. His biggest stickler was the incest. He stated that the film cast collective shame upon an entire community. First, I'll mention I was shocked to find I could not write an opposing op-ed, but had to write a letter to the editor. And then I found that that letter would be heavily edited. Here's what they printed. In the 13 years since the novel Push was published, I have talked to thousands of women who have been sexually abused, some of whom have had experiences that make what happened in Push, which was made into the film Precious, look like a walk in the park. I am not a social scientist, but a creative artist. I took and will continue to take the stories of women I have listened to and turn them into fiction. I write about Black women because it's the world I know. Ishmael Reed mentions that incest is not confined to one group of people. I agree, but I argue that it does have a different place in African American culture than it has in white American culture. During slavery, many Black women were impregnated by their masters, who were also often their fathers. The white male was literally the master father of the plantation. I would like to see Black males less defensive and more courageous in their investigations of sexual abuse in the Black community. I would like to see more, not less, written about rape. Here is a portion of what was left on the editing floor. Mr. Reed mentions that incest is not confined to one group of people. I agree, but I argue that it does have a different place in African American culture than it has in white American culture. During slavery, many Black women were impregnated by their masters, who were often also their fathers. The white male was literally the master father of the plantation. He had sex with who he wanted to, Black women, children, and men. This was the family structure some slaves were exposed to. Black men were not allowed to act out the role of father. They themselves were raped like women in addition to being turned into stud-like breeders. We as a race and as a nation have yet to deal with the fact black men and boys were raped like bitches during slavery, nor have we dealt with the impact that that has had on the generations of us that came out of slavery. I would like to see black males less defensive and more courageous in their investigation of sexual abuse in the black community. I would like to see more, not less, written by African Americans on the conflation of rape, racism, and internalized oppression. That didn't get printed. I'm quoting now from Forward Motion, a socialist magazine, and this is a quote from an article by Scott Kurashige, which is how we got to this point. And he's talking about an Asian perspective on the Los Angeles Rebellion. In an extremely high-profile incident, a 15-year-old African-American girl, Latasha Harlins, was shot in the back of the head and killed by Korean merchant Soon Ja-doo. Black real estate developer Danny Bakewell organized a boycott of the store but was frequently accused of grandstanding. Though the incident occurred before the Rodney King beating, the videotaped showing of the killing of Latasha Harlin was shown over and over, arguably in an attempt to deflect from the Rodney King incident. Doo was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, and a white Republican-appointed judge, Joyce Carlin, sentenced her to probation. She killed this girl and didn't do any time. When I called my family about during the riots, the rebellion over the Rodney King beating and the acquittal, and they told me, well, it was really about Latasha Harlins. And I said, who is Latasha Harlins? And so I started to do some research and just talk to people. And I wrote this poem after a lot of voices came to me about Latasha Harlins. And I write this poem in the voice of the little girl who gets killed. And it's called Strange Juice, or the Murder of Latasha Harlins. I remember my boyfriend, the dark behind the brown of his eyes and how he looked in his leather. I was walking with that good feeling, thinking about him. The next day of school, maybe I go, maybe I don't. Who gives a fuck? And nothing special. Nothing is so special now that I'm dead. It's the day I died. And the sky was red-brown gauze. You could see patches of blue if you look up, but I don't look up. I hardly ever look up. My eyes on the ground, checking out my feet in orange Reeboks. What else I remember? Now that I look back, it seems like the collard greens piled up on plywood boards at the door was huge green tears that tried to warn me. The day was the same but different. I didn't do nothing. I slid open the glass door of the refrigerator that keeps all the beverages cool. It's so hot here in LA. My eyes glance up at the camera, pointed like a gun from the corner of the store. Fuck it, I slip the cold bottle of orange juice in my backpack, go to the counter. I'll get some gum. If she says something, I'll say, oh, bitch, I was gonna buy this juice. You think I'm stupid? Wonder what we gonna do in school tomorrow. I'd be so glad to get out the 9th grade, go to high school if I'm late for homeroom one more time. Oh, bitch, please, I was gonna pay for ugh, foo, shit, sue. Speak English, ho. Take your damn juice. I wasn't stealing nothing from you, you chink ass ho. She grabbed me, bitch. I hit that hoe upside her jaw. Who the fuck she thinks she is putting her hands on somebody? Fuck this hoe. I ain't gonna argue with this bitch. I turn my back and I walk away. I see the collard greens again, only now they're growing like big trees, only now they're growing like big trees. Then I see a red dirt road in the middle of the salad bar, no lie, like I'm high or something. Then everything is normal, Koreatown fruit stand again, Del Monte corn out of can poured in a stainless steel tub, iceberg, romaine brand muffins, and brownies wrapped in clear plastic. Fuck it, I'm not thirsty, no way. I don't hear the blast till I'm dead. I don't feel nothing either as I split in half. A dog yelps and every sound I ever heard flies out my mouth on green wings. Crimson waterfalls open in my skull and my bones come loose. The dog is screaming now like a siren, and in the distance a bucket of water spills over on a dusty red dirt road, and my heart quits, falls face first in shattered glass on a concrete floor. The camera keeps rolling, my left leg twitches. I don't cry. 15, green as greens, passing from sight under broken bottles of light. 2, I don't remember what I did wrong. Somebody hit you, you hit them back. She didn't have to shoot me. I was born here and someone can shoot me and go home and eat turkey on Thanksgiving. What kind of shit is that? Videotape the bitch killing me, the hoes on videotape recording the end of my days, reeling obscenely for TV cameras. My blood, sweet Jesus, rolling 20s, bounty hunters, PJs, Imperial Court, NWA, LAPD, South Central, Hollywood, 18th Street, Diamond Riders, Easy Riders. It's a brown thing, it's a black thing, Crips, Bloods, Mexicans together this night. I don't remember. I just wanted some juice, and now I'm dead, killed by a model minority success story. Listen, is anybody gonna say anything? I was gonna get a new leather jacket, orange, to match my Reeboks. I was passing math and doing very good in English. Fuck history, I'm tired of hearing about George Washington and Columbus. I told that cracker, shit, motherfucker, what about us? No, I wasn't pregnant. But I was gonna have a baby one day, definitely. I like Luther Vandross, Tone Loc, and Queen Latifah. Listen, is anybody gonna say anything? Community service, a white bitch with a pink slit between her legs like mine drips red, a white girl that probably got into law school on the affirmative action birthed by black people's struggle, sitting on a seat that was opened up for her by Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hammond. No, black people. African Americans like me marching under fire hoses, broken glass, gasoline bodies, testicles sliced off, strange fruit tossed to dogs swinging from trees. This white judge, woman, hooded in mahogany walled chambers, decides my life is not worth nothing. A 15-year-old girl equals 0 in this white bitch's book. She sentences this yellow gunslinger to community service and probation. What are the terms of her probation? That she don't kill nobody white? Does anybody hear me? Without my tongue, 15 and out of time. Listen to the gasoline on the wind. Listen to my blood rhyme, drip drop on the sidewalk. Hear me, children, and burn. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Patrick Phillips. No, I'm Major Jackson. It's such a pleasure to read with Patrick Phillips and my old friend Sapphire. This is called Ferguson. Once there was a boy who thought it a noble idea to lie down in the middle of the street and sleep. For 4 hours, no one bothered him, but let him lie on the road as though he were an enchantment. This became newsworthy, and soon helicopters hovered above, hosing his curled torso and thick legs, and spotlights televised the world over. Foreign correspondents focused on the neighborhood and its relative poverty as recognized by the plethora of low-hanging jeans worn by shirtless men, and loud music issuing from passing cars, which had the effect of drowning out everyone's already bottled up thoughts about the boy sleeping in the middle of the street. Others jumped in front of cameras, seizing an opportunity to be seen by their relatives on the other side of town because they had run out of minutes on prepaid cell phones. The roadkill in the neighborhood and some on that very block, rodents, cats, possums, feeling equal amounts of jealousy and futility, each began to rise and return to their den holes, cursing the boy sleeping in the street for his virtuosic performance of stillness and tribulation in the city. The drug-addicted men and women leaning into doorways like art installations were used to being ignored, but they too felt affronted by the boy sleeping in the street and so folded their cardboard homes. For the first hour, he practiced not breathing. For 10 seconds, he would hold his breath, and then he practiced longer sets of minutes during the next 3 hours until he was able to stretch out his non-breathing for whole hunks at a time. When his breathing returned, it was so faint, his chest and shoulders barely moved. Infinitesimal amounts of life poured out of him, but no one noticed. The police cordoned off his body and after some time declared him dead because they had only seen black men lying prone on the street as corpses, but never as sleeping humans. The whole world, eager and hungry for a Lazarus moment, watched and waited to see when he would awaken and rise to his feet, especially his neighbors with minutes remaining on cell phones who filmed and animatedly discoursed behind yellow tape the ecstasies and muted sorrows of watching a boy sleep in the middle of the street. This is Stand Your Ground. America, how often I have applauded your flagpoles. We as citizens struggle to find common ground, yet do much to damage the planks of your ark. Not a soft tune we make, glissando of the harmonized, we have a want problem, more of ourselves problem, us versus them in the great race to prosperity. In his introduction to metaphysics, Heidegger asks, why are there beings at all? We have as guides, clansmen, and eugenicists who proclaim all others as less. It is, I admit, the slapping of your ropes, tolling a perfect union, but is a measure of your worth a silent clang elsewhere? How is it a ripple also runs through me when your wind rises? Your cloth is nation, hauled down or half-mast like a deferred dream, only earthly because we strive on a path hidden by dead leaves. That a man can shoot a teenager is par, as we say, we iotas, deltas, crips, knights, new tribesmen, and new codes should in earnest put away our swords and talk shows. Think, our watermelons have so many seeds, and we a galaxy in us dissolving our supernovas. The mysteries we have, an unmitigated burning of sound and fury, not organism of one, but organs. America, I've had enough. This is titled On Disappearing, and it's for my ancestors. On disappearing. I have not disappeared. The boulevard is full of my steps. The sky is full of my thinking. An archbishop prays for my soul, even though we met only once, and even then he was busy waving at a congregation. The ticking clocks in Vermont sway back and forth as though sweeping up my eyes and my tattoos and my metaphors. And what comes up are the great paragraphs of dust, which also carry motes of my existence. I have not disappeared. My wife quivers inside a kiss. My pulse was given to her many times in many countries. The chunks of bread we dip in olive oil is communion with our ancestors, who also have not disappeared. Their delicate songs I wear on my eyelids. Their smiles have given me freedom, which is a crater I keep falling in. When I bite into the two halves of an orange whose cross-section resembles my lungs, a delta of juices bursts down my chin, and like magic makes me appear to those who think I've disappeared. It's too bad war makes people disappear like chess pieces, and that prisons turn prisoners into movie endings. When I fade into the mountains on a forest trail, I still have not disappeared, even though its green facade turns my arms and legs into branches of oak. It is then I belong to a southerly wind, which by now you have mistaken as me nodding back and forth like a Hasid in prayer, or mother who has just lost her son to gunfire in Detroit. I have not disappeared. In my children, I see my bulging face pressing further into the mysteries. In the library in Tucson, on a plain above Buenos Aires, on a field where nearby burns a controlled fire, I'm held by a professor, a general, and a photographer. One burns a finely wrapped cigar, then sniffs the scented pages of my books, scouring for the bitter smell of control. I hold him in my mind like a chalice. I have not disappeared. I swish the amber hue of lager on my tongue and ponder the drilling rigs in the Gulf of Alaska and all the oil-painted plovers. When we talk about limits, we disappear. In Jasper, Texas, you can disappear on a strip of gravel. I am a life in sacred language. Termites toil over a grave, and my mind is a ravine of yesterdays. At a glance from across the room, I wear September on my face, which is eternal and does not disappear, even if you close your eyes once and for all, simultaneously, like two coffins. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Patrick Phillips, and I'm delighted to be a part of this conversation, and it's wonderful to join Major and Sapphire and Kelly here at the Sheen Center. So my book, Blood at the Root, really began about 10 years ago when my friend, the poet Natasha Trethewey, asked me a startling question. Why was it that she, a Southern woman of color, wrote so often about blackness, yet I, a white man from Georgia, and from one of the most racist places in America, never said a word about whiteness? Why, Natasha asked me, do you think race is only a subject for black writers? Why do you think you're not involved? That moment changed my life, and it started me on a search for the truth about my home place. So I'm going to read a few passages to give you a sense of what I learned when I started digging into the truth behind an old ghost story that I heard, that I first heard in the backseat of a school bus when I was a second grader in 1977. That was the year my parents moved to the little rural community of Forsyth County, Georgia, in the Appalachian foothills north of Atlanta. Soon after we got there, I noticed that unlike in my old neighborhood, there were no people of color anywhere. And everyone I knew in Forsyth County, children, teachers, and adults, used the N-word and other racial slurs exclusively to refer to African Americans. When I asked why they hated black people so much, the kids I knew on the school bus told me what they'd heard from their parents and their grandparents. A long, long time ago, the story went, this local white girl was raped and killed, and in the days after her body was found, gangs of white men, quote, ran out the entire black population. This, I was told, was why Forsyth County was still all white in the 1970s. and why, at least according to my classmates there, it always would be. My book is called Blood at the Root, A Racial Cleansing in America, and it's the product of my 10-year search for the truth behind that old legend, and my discovery that while that story was riddled with lies and distorted by bigotry, it was no myth. At its heart, it was a terrible reality. And as I discovered more about the waves of violence that transformed Forsyth in 1912, I began to understand how the old tale, which was always stripped of names and dates and places, there were never any particulars, had always made the racial cleansing seem like only a story, like something too far back in the mists of time to ever really understand, rather than like what it was, a deliberate and sustained campaign of terror waged by ordinary white men. This is an excerpt that'll give you a sense of how the mobs worked in September and October of 1912 and their earliest targets. The night riders fired shots into front doors, threw rocks through windows, and hollered warnings that it was time for black families to get. But of all their methods, torches and kerosene worked best, since a fire created a blazing sign for all to see and left the victims no place to ever come back to. In mid-October, the Augusta Chronicle reported that a score or more of homes have been burned during the past few weeks, and 5 Negro churches. The arsonists must have been terrifying wherever they struck, but for Forsyth's poor black farmers, the burning of churches was a true catastrophe, striking not just at the community's spiritual home, but at what W.E.B. Du Bois called the social center of Negro life. In 1903, sitting in his Atlanta University office, just 40 miles south of Forsyth County, Du Bois had described Georgia's rural black congregations as, quote, the most characteristic expression of African character in the entire community. The erasure of such places from the map of Forsyth County was complete. Today, all that's left are a few scant details about the dates on which churches were founded, lot numbers for the land on which they stood, and the names of a handful of ministers and worshipers who once gathered there. All that can be said for certain is that again and again in the fall of 1912, white men sloshed gasoline and kerosene onto the benches and wooden floors of such rooms, then backed out into the dark, tossing lit matches as they went. All over the county, beneath the ground on which black churches stood, the soil is rich with ashes. This terrible tradition has continued, of course, up to the present day. And while early attacks like the deadly bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, I think is seared into the national consciousness for a lot of people, there are always new examples emerging, from the burning of Macedonia Church in Springfield, Mass. On the night that Barack Obama was elected, to Dylan Roof's massacre of 9 parishioners at Emmanuel AME in Charleston in 2015. Blood at the Root has a great deal more to say about how the white people of Forsyth County used lynching, armed invasion, arson, and dynamite to drive out more than 1,000 of their black neighbors. But for the sake of time, I'm going to skip ahead to an issue that is really at the heart of the book, and that is the question of reparations for the victims of these crimes. In 1987, when the mobs of Forsyth once again made national news, the Georgia governor appointed what was called a biracial committee to investigate the charge of unlawfully taken land and to consider calls for reparations for the victims of 1912. And this is an excerpt from the middle of the book that will give you a sense of how this biracial committee worked and just how stubbornly local whites have refused to acknowledge any of this history. White members of the Forsyth County Biracial Committee, many of whom owned large amounts of property in Forsyth, rejected outright the idea of returning land and paying reparations, and they wrote at length about the fear this demand had stirred up in the local community. The white leaders of Forsyth admitted that racial incidents allegedly drove blacks from the confines of the county, but they argued that economics played an instrumental role in the exodus. They also claimed that, quote, the advent of the boll weevil, early signs of the Depression, and the, quote, shifting of the black population to Atlanta certainly had an equal impact. In their view, most of Forsyth's 1,098 refugees, quote, voluntarily relocated. But when I went looking in the archival records, I found a mountain of evidence that the exodus was the result of a coordinated, months-long campaign of terror, and that the land of black landowners was plundered in the years that followed, as quote, abandoned lots were slowly, quietly absorbed into the property of neighboring whites. Today, many of those same land lots are home not to hog pens and cow pastures, but gated communities and luxury subdivisions filled with million-dollar homes. What was once stolen with a wink and a nod at the county courthouse has now become some of the most valuable real estate in all of metropolitan Atlanta, in a place that is among the top 25 wealthiest counties in America. Until I began work on this book, I too had always tiptoed around the subject of race, and I tried to uphold a kind of white, liberal, Hippocratic oath: do no harm, give no offense. But since Blood at the Root was published, I have been engaged in some very public conversations about how even well-meaning white people like myself are the beneficiaries of deeply ingrained systems of oppression. And I've spent a lot of time encouraging readers to ask the questions most comfortable white people hope no one will ever ask, about how their community's power and affluence were first acquired. Ta-Nehisi Coates calls this alternative to willful ignorance white curiosity, a commodity that has always been in very short supply. So as we think about the role of storytelling in our national conversation on race, I'd like to suggest that stories contain a power that can be used for good or evil. They can do the vital work of setting the record straight and of exposing insidious old lies, as I tried to do in this book. But stories are also a way of erasing the past and overwriting it with a comforting fiction, often deliberately designed to spare white people from ever turning and facing their ancestors' crimes. So in many ways, I felt I was engaged in a contest of stories as I wrote this book. It was my attempt to finally challenge the old, whitewashed, conscience-clearing myth of how Forsyth became all white, and to tell as best I could the story of what really happened. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining us for the presentations by Patrick and Major and Sapphire. And now I'm going to welcome them back onto the stage for the talk back and a question and answer. So please. Thank you all again so much. I'd just like to introduce the artist, starting with Sapphire. Sapphire is the author of two best-selling novels, Push and The Kid. Push was made into the Academy Award-winning major motion picture Precious, and the film adaptation received the Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Supporting Actress. Sapphire's work has been translated into 13 languages and has been adapted for stage in the United States and Europe. Her poetry, fiction, and essays have appeared in The Black Scholar, The New York Times Magazine, The New York Times Book Review, The Teacher's Voice, New Yorker, Spin, and Bomb. Thank you. That's Sapphire. Major, who I've had the privilege of being able to study with, is the author of 4 collections of poetry, Roll Deep, Holding Company, Hoops, and Leaving Saturn, which was awarded the Cave Canem Poetry Prize and was a finalist for the National Black Critics Circle Award in Poetry. His poems and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, Plowshares Poetry, Tin House, and in Best American Poetry. He is the recipient of a Whitting Writers Award and has been honored by the Pew Fellowship in the Arts and the Witter Bynner Foundation in conjunction with the Library of Congress. And Patrick is the author of Blood at the Root, A Racial Cleansing in America, which you just read from, and 3 poetry collections. His most recent Elegy for a Broken Machine was named a finalist for the 2015 National Book Award in Poetry. His 2 earlier collections are Boy and Chattahoochee. I know how to say that because I'm from Louisiana. I got you. He is also the translator of When We Leave Each Other, selected poems of Heinrich Nordbrandt, a Guggenheim and National Endowment for the Arts Fellow. And Patrick lives in Brooklyn and teaches at Stanford University. So again, welcome. I wanted to start out by, as I was listening to you read, and Sapphire, you opening with the poem about Latasha Harlins, and then us going into Major, your poem about Ferguson. And I found this theme about witnessing. And, you know, when LaTosha Harlan's happened, we all saw it on camera. I mean, I was very young, but you can still see it. I mean, we saw it then, and then you can't help but think to yourself about how we saw it again with Eric Gardner, and we saw it again with Philando Castile, and we saw it again with Alton Sterling. And, you know, then tying that into what Patrick presented in his selection with this whole other level of witnessing in terms of bringing the truth out. I can't help but ask myself, we all are seeing the same things. We're all seeing this. We also live in a time where our access to information, our access to knowledge is unprecedented. How is it that, and I'm going to quote a Pew Center research on race relations, that 40% of white Americans don't see an issue with race relations as opposed to 28% of black, 40% of white Americans say that they don't have a problem with race relations as opposed to 28% of blacks. How is it that we're all living in the same country? We're all seeing the same things. We all have access to the same information. In your opinion, where is the disconnect? And anybody can start.
I think for me, the disconnect in how we perceive race has a lot to do with who is going to benefit by racism. So we live in a country, we've already talked about that today, that, you know, much of the wealth, much of what is happening good for certain classes is based on a history of slavery and appropriation of other people's property. So to acknowledge racism would be hard for such people because it might mean having to give up something. It might mean having to acknowledge what you have is ill-begotten. It might mean that your kids aren't the smartest kids on the block, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And so they're loath to see what they see. Whereas black people, when we look at the video of LaTosha Harlan being shot in the back of the head, it is confirming a reality that we know that's being denied all the time. So therefore, what our seeing does is it confirms our sanity.
Yeah, I also think, as you were very rightly pointing to those moments of violence, it occurs to me that part of what we are witnessing, what we are seeing is the fact that violence has always been at the core of the American psyche. It's how this nation was constructed. Why do the videos get interpreted differently? It's because of dominant narratives around the disenfranchised, who gets to write the history books, who gets to report on these particular events that, going back to what Patrick was saying, that get erased. And so I think what I'm admiring about generations of writers now in the past 50, 60 years is just a willingness to reckon with that history and to acknowledge it. My wish is that it was part of our national conversation alongside holidays for presidents, holidays for so-called, well, we have a holiday for everything. We really do need a day of reconciliation where we acknowledge the amount of lives that have been expended to get us to where we are today.
Right.
Yeah. You know, I would just add to that, you know, I truly feel that I have been on both sides of this, you know, and I say that with with some shame that, you know, I came to write this book very late in the game in a lot of ways, and it took that push from Natasha. So I have been, and even the fact that my parents moved into this place, one of the questions I got a lot on the book tour was like, what the hell were you doing there? Right? Like, why did you move there? And one answer to that is that my parents are both from Birmingham. They grew up in the Birmingham of Bull Connor and George Wallace. So they'd seen a lot of this stuff. They had a pretty thick skin about it. But the other is we didn't know a whole lot about the very particular case of this kind of violence. We didn't know about the lynching that happened on the town square. And as white people, we didn't have to know. Mm-hmm. And that story about Natasha, the reason Natasha recognized the name Forsyth County is, as a black woman, even coming in from a different state, from Mississippi, she was warned early on, you can't go there. Mm-hmm. And so and that was a real eye-opening moment for me as a white person. Among the many ways in which white supremacy privileges your experiences, you don't even have to find out where you're going to. You assume that it will be a place where you can live without being murdered, without the citizens of that place rising up against you. So I felt like I personally have been on the other side of it, and I don't know exactly how we get other people there, but I do think truth-telling certainly matters a great deal. On the Cumming Square, there is a monument on the corner where Rob Edwards was lynched, and it is a monument to a Confederate general who was a big part of unraveling all the gains of Reconstruction in the 1870s. So a white supremacist son of a bitch is the statue that stands on that spot, and that has to matter.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, Patrick, we were able to talk for a little bit backstage, and I was sharing how, first of all, Facebook is not the place to have any type of real conversation, but there have been so many times where I've been angry that when something like Elton Sterling happens, my white friends don't say anything. Mm-hmm. There was even one particular instance where, the mascot, our LSU Tiger, back home was going to be put to sleep, and there was like a huge outcry about it, but yet nobody said anything about Elton Sterling, and I was enraged. Yeah. And, I do think that there's just this idea that, this is your story, and then this is my story. When we were all here together, we're all in it together, and yet we've compartmentalized whose stories they are. And that there have to be more white people who are willing to tell the stories and to add to that. In your introduction, you wrote that when you saw the photo of these young children who were lynched, you saw that as an obligation to tell their story. And so how do we move the conversation forward when there is, to something that you mentioned in the book, there's so much defensiveness on the part of white people, and there's so much anger on the part of black people because there's that defensiveness. It seems to be such a divide in terms of us trying to come together to have meaningful conversation. I'm sorry, you look like you were going to say something.
I think about the gains of the civil rights, and I think about the power of that particular moment, even though there was great resistance, and out of that came a martyr who we celebrate today, even if we only celebrate part of his vision, because his later vision was truly radical, of course, Martin Luther King. But that was a movement in which it had at its core both black, white, other. It had as its core this kind of moral center that said, this is wrong, no matter what religion you practice. And so that was a social movement driven by mainly religious leaders. And many of them bonded by a huge faith that kind of operated in their lives. I'm not sure if we have that kind of foundation that will allow us to make those kinds of decisions that this is wrong. No one should be on a highway at risk of being killed because they're just driving and they're not white. No one in this country. How do you invest people in that story, or in that fear, or I'm not sure without something that's equivalent as some sort of moral center that informs.
I think it's a good point, but I also think that what we're talking about as storytellers, as poets, is creating that moral center. You know, I mean, and that in the process of telling the truth, as best we know it, we create a moral center for ourselves, and other people can gravitate toward that. And if other people are doing the same, they can gravitate toward us. Also, and by us, I mean toward the truth that we're telling. And I think that we benefited from the civil rights movement, and we didn't outgrow it, but we did. You know, I was born and raised a Catholic, and there was a tremendous moral center in the church in the 1970s in Latin America, and also even when I was growing up and addressing poverty and stuff and abuse. I can remember one of the nuns where I went to catechism knocking on my door where I was living with my mother in Philadelphia. This is a little white nun knocking on the door and saying, well, you know, Sapphire said that you hit her. You know, coming to South Philadelphia to say your daughter said you hit her. So that has, in some ways, with the priest abuse scandal, evaporated for me. Yeah. The church as a moral center has evaporated for me, and so I had to take my memories of the moral certitude and rightness that I had as a child and carry that forward in my work and in my own life. And I think that's what a lot of people are grappling with today. You know, those who haven't left the church are trying to change it. You know what I mean? But we can't. People were in the church in Martin Luther King's day. There was no leaving it. Certain things hadn't been exposed. You know, and we can't go back to that. We have to be in the place that we are now.
Yeah, I was mentioning it just to think about that was a language that people understood no matter their color.
Exactly.
It was somehow a way to kind of bring folks together. And I agree with you. The art, the poems, the stories, the dances, the plays really create this whole other means. It's the other estate that we come to recognize ourselves in. I'm wondering, how do you introduce someone to like a radical jazz musician activist like Fred Ho, and have them be invested in his narrative or his stories or in his issues? That's what I'm grappling with.
Well, one of the things Fred Ho did was he also wrote, and he also taught, and you know, he had a cadre of young radical musicians who he taught and who are anti-racist and who are and a lot of them are Asian,
across racial lines.
Are Asian and actively refuting the anti-black sentiment in some of the Asian communities. So we need to take credit for what we've done.
Right.
We're out there. We're I'm no longer actively teaching, but I'm still always teaching. Right. And that's what we can do. You know, we can't do everything, and we're gonna debilitate ourselves by not acknowledging what we have done and what we can do.
And I want to jump in on that because I agree, but I'm also aware in the last 18 months, as I've gone around talking about the stuff I've been doing, you know, I've gotten a little window into, you know, the burden of dealing that the black community bears in dealing with this stuff and with dealing with white people who are constantly needing to be brought along and falling off the back. You know, my parents were. They knew King in the 60s. My dad is a Methodist minister, so my dad was in the church, and he was one of these lefty white clergymen in Atlanta, and they knew King, and so I was raised on a narrative of progress, and my parents marched, and the narrative, and they'd come out of Birmingham, and they broke with their parents over integration, but the narrative was, every day the gears click one more, you know, they ratchet us a little forward, and every day the world grows a tiny bit more just, right? And I loved that narrative, but I've had to discard it in order to write this book because, I think a lot of white people cling to that because it suggests that at some point you'll be done. And oh, thank God, we don't have to do this anymore. I don't have to think about this anymore. And so I think for the Black community, I completely understand the sense of look at what all we've done. But I think also for a lot of white people, look at what all you haven't done. And I include myself in that. In writing the stuff, I realized that my education was white supremacist, right? That when I was reading about lynching, I hadn't read Ida B. Wells. And I realized a lot of what I needed to know about lynching had been written in the 1870s. I just hadn't read it. And I realized that Du Bois had already diagnosed a lot of what was happening in North Georgia in the 1900s. And why did I not know those texts? Because I thought that what I needed to know was in books written by white people. On some level, my education imparted that. So I think the legacy of the civil rights movement is complicated because I think a lot of white people like to use it to let themselves off the hook.
Right. Well, and so on that point, I wanted to just ask, where do you all see progress being made, if you feel like you see progress being made?
Well, I think there's multiracial alliances in the arts. I think there's multiracial alliances. It may look like Black Lives Matter is predominantly Black folk, but that's a very powerful social movement right now. And this next generation that's coming up, they're so fierce. I mean, we see that somewhat with what's happening in Parkland, Florida. It's the young people who are not inhibited by mores, not inhibited by conventions. We were kind of talking about that a little bit. That can be sometimes, you have to give them a sense of history. And that's really, really important. But because they can't make the same mistakes. But in terms of progress, if there wasn't a movement like Black Lives Matter and all the conversation that's coming around that, in this day and age, I would be morose instead.
Well, I also think we can't look at all the movements that have benefited so deeply from the civil rights movement, and that would be the lesbian and gay movement, the transgender movement. So all of those movements that are in the forefront now have at their base, the civil rights movement, that quest for justice. And I was also thinking about one of my heroes. Her name eludes me right now, but there's an 85-year-old Catholic nun who was arrested and did time a few years ago for climbing over some barrier and painting roses on nuclear missiles. And what to me comes out of that is one of the things that older people do is we put a lot on the younger generation. And I had an old woman challenge me in terms of activism. And one of the things she said, when these kids go out there, they have kids to raise. They have jobs to lose. You don't have a job to lose. You don't have kids to raise. It's time for us to literally lay our bodies down. She's talking about, this was to a group of old women, that we can't just put all the activism on young people who are studying 40 hours, and that it has to be everybody's job, you know what I mean? I believe that, and part of my quest now is what next? How, And I think that's for everybody,
I struggle to find hope. But I think I've just had to change my thinking on all of it in that I think I bought into the notion of, the notion of somehow the job would at some point be completed. But in Forsyth County in 1987, the march that my family were a part of, that sort of exposed the whole world to what had been going on in this place, because there was a violent march there in 1987, and Oprah came down, and it made a lot of headlines. Well, that march was led by Hosea Williams. And, if anybody saw the film Selma, or if you're old enough to remember the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Hosea was right next to John Lewis. when the billy club wielding Alabama state troopers come. So Hosea Williams was there in 1965, and he was back as the hero in my hometown 22 years later and doing exactly the same thing in exactly the same way. And he lined us up 2 by 2, and the instructions were, I guarantee you, exactly the same in 87 as they had been in 1965. And he was a warrior. And I got the sense, this is not someone expecting for the job to be finished. This is not a noun, this is a verb. This is a way of being.
Wow.
And so I've tried to, think that way. This is something that you do. This is not something that you get to the end of.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. I want to take it out to the audience to ask questions. Do we have? Oh, right here.
Good evening. I want to thank you all for sharing with us this evening. And we're having a conversation. Oh, by the way, I'm a Roman Catholic, a religious brother working for the Archdiocese of New York. We're having a conversation, and it's a rich conversation. I've heard it said that in black families, we're always talking about race. And maybe in white families, they're not talking about race, but I don't know that. I guess my question is, and maybe contrasting, what is the conversation like? What is being said and what is not being said, even today in white families? And by contrast, you kind of alluded to there were some things that we need to talk about in black families. Can you go more in depth about what, in your opinion, is not being talked about as openly and honestly in black families as needs to be in this day and age, particularly?
For me, that would be the legacy of sexual violence. And there's been such an attack from outside, white on black, that we haven't taken time to really acknowledge the depth of sexual violence, which permeates all cultures, but that's not what we're talking about. Right now, you're asking me about what black families need to talk about, and I think that's at the core. We suffer deeply from domestic violence. We are victims of perpetration, but we are also perpetrators. And there's a way that we are not stopping the cycle of violence because we are still in denial. I mean, this is what this guy who was attacking the movie Precious, he was so ashamed that these issues were out, that people could see that this is how some black families function. So in that denial, in that, that quest to shut it down and present a Bill Cosby type family, how about that? The truth gets shut down, and the ability to heal and the ability to acknowledge this is not black behavior, this is human behavior. I mean, one of the women who talked the most about sexual abuse was Virginia Woolf. Talking about this was the Victorian patriarch's right, access to his family's body. And so I think this is part of the legacy of slavery. It's part of the legacy of being, the family structure that we learned that we inherited was basically imitation of European, and the Europeans were patriarchal, and so we became patriarchal. But we are not a patriarchal family structure in some ways. Many black families are matriarchal in some ways. So I just think that we haven't really looked at the damage that we're doing to ourselves because we're so busy taking care of the damage that is being inflicted upon us.
And as far as the other part of the question about what's the conversation, I mean, I guess I'll field that one. What's the conversation going on in white families? I can't speak, obviously, comprehensively on that, but I got a little window into some of what goes on. My son is looking at colleges, and we were down last weekend at Temple University in Philly. He's grown up in Brooklyn. So he's looking at Temple, which is in North Philadelphia. in a predominantly black neighborhood. And there was a Q&A for the parents. And there were two Q&As side by side. And one of them was the financial aid Q&A. And all the black families were at the financial aid Q&A. And the other Q&A was like campus safety. And all the white parents were at the campus. I was standing in the hallway, I'd had enough, and I was kind of leaning in and out of either one. And the campus safety one was almost entirely wealthier suburban parents whose kids have a Jones to go to the city, right? And so they were terrified that their sons and daughters were going to the city. And Temple's campus is beautiful. And most people around the world would feel incredibly lucky to be in this room we were sitting in. These parents were profoundly terrified of sending their kids there. And this was on the day that the Parkland shooting, or the day after that the shooting had happened in a wealthy, white high school. And this is the same in Columbine, it's the same in Newtown. And so my head was about to explode because these people were sending their kids to high schools and in communities that look exactly like Parkland, Florida. And meanwhile, they were, just completely irrationally afraid of the poor, working, and middle-class people of North Philadelphia. So it just struck me as insane, and the common denominator was fear. And I think, I think that is obviously something that has been exploited a great deal in our presidential politics lately, but I do think that is going on. And I can also just, one other anecdote is, my relatives all still live in Birmingham, and I went to the Civil Rights Museum there, which is amazing because you're actually on the blocks where a lot of this happened, and you look out the window and you see the photograph of the dogs and fire hoses, and you're looking at the corner. And I asked my aunt and uncle what they thought of the museum, and they said, what do you mean? And I said, the Civil Rights Museum. And they're like, oh, I didn't even know, no, never heard of it. So, yeah. I get windows, and that's not to say that there aren't people having more serious conversations, but I think a lot of fear and a lot of very privileged ignorance.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a graduate of Temple.
Hey!
I grew up in that neighborhood, and
That's
it's
right, you're
really
Philly, that's
hard
right.
for me to think that I too was at orientation.
Yeah.
Where most of the people there were white students and their parents, in which they were instructed to get off at one subway stop and avoid the other subway stop. And they
Right.
said, these people are dangerous.
Right.
And I reared back, like, I am these people. What is that? And that goes to the narrative that I was talking about earlier that kind of gets recycled, and it's sad to hear that 20 plus years later, that same narrative is being passed on to incoming students. That's a very interesting question. What gets talked at the dinner table? And, for me as a parent of 3 beautiful children, black children, and now one white stepson, it's very interesting because with my black children, it's all about be careful. Be careful out there. A lot of joy. Let me just make sure there's a lot of laughter at my dinner table, but my children, they know when I'm about to give them a lecture because they start getting up, going to plates, But, with my stepson, it's one of know the history of this country and understand the privilege that you are inheriting, that is being given to you. And this is something that I feel newly arrived immigrants, everyone should understand the history of this country and why we suffer some of the social ills that we do suffer, so that they can contextualize a lot of what they see but don't understand.
Absolutely. And actually, I love to refer to, Dr. Joy DeGruy coined the phrase post-traumatic slave disorder. And so going back to what you were saying, Sapphire, Major, and Patrick, like you cannot understand how we're all continuing to participate in this if you don't go all the way back to the psychologies that were created, the fear,
The trauma.
Yes.
Absolutely.
The
Trauma that we live under.
exploitation is, black folk don't have a monopoly on that. I think there's some serious disenfranchised
Absolutely.
white working class, poor people who clutch on to their identity as white people, not realizing that that is the very thing that's blinding them from going after the gains, making gains in their own communities, because they're blinded by the hate, they're blinded by what they see as kind of advances that are being given to non-white people. But if they looked a little past that rhetoric, they will realize that they share a lot of who is being exploited in this country.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and I found that in the research I was doing. You know, the explosion of violence in Forsyth County was by poor people against poor people. You know, and there's no question there were some folks profiting off of that division, as there are today. You know, and I've always think you were alluding to kings later. You know, the king that we celebrate is not the full man. And you know, he was in Memphis for a garbage worker strike. And he was working on the Poor People's Campaign, which Hosea took up. And he was interested in expanding this globally, and just for all of the poor people in the world. And that was the next step in the movement. So, you know, we're obviously that strain of our politics is in a sorry state right now of uniting people on the bottom, I think.
Have another question?
This question is more directed for Mr. Phillips, but I'd like to open it to everybody. So obviously the conversation surrounding race takes place on a national and international scale, but you found yourself having to return home to confront the history of racism in your town and its modern place. And I find myself in a similar situation, but with a northern town that has a deeply ingrained history of racism and a really problematic modern setting. And how do you return home and create change on a local level? It's coming from a conversation that takes place on such a large scale, that takes place in a lot of the academies. How do you return home and engage those directly around you to create change on this smaller, more intimate scale?
Well, thank you for the question. I appreciate it's a great question. You know, and I think we're all poets up here, and I think I did write a poet's book in that I don't really believe a lot in. I don't understand how scale up works in terms of art. Like, I believe in the local, the particular, the specific. And the thing that guided me in writing the book was I just wanted to tell the truth. I wanted to get it right. And I thought that truth was not something I could see from 30,000 feet. I needed to, you know, in video game terms, I needed to be down in the maze. You know, I had to get down on the ground to understand it. And I get this question a lot from when I've talked about the book, from I think young white people who feel this about where they come from. One thing to say is kudos that you're here.
Yeah.
You know, you're already on the right track, that you're here. The other thing to do is to read up. You know, I had not read Du Bois. I hadn't read Baldwin well enough. I had not read Ida B. Wells. I had a whole tradition and a whole history that was a blind spot in my knowledge, and I had to catch up on that. So that helped incredibly, and continues to help me. But then the other thing is, you know, in terms of your question, it's easy for me to call out strangers. It's easy for me to call out what the thing I recognize myself as having done in the past. It's easy to call that out in other people. It's hard to call that out at the Thanksgiving dinner table. It's hard to do it with friends and people from back home. But maybe more important than strangers, I don't think strangers listen. But if I call out my parents on something, you know, I've said to my dad, who was a civil rights marcher and everything, he said some racist crap occasionally because of his generation. It's just things that are ingrained in him. We just as an example, we always go to the U.S. Open tennis tournament, and my dad one time in front of my teenage sons said, "You're not going to believe this. Like, that guy pulled out that match, and he's black." You know, like not only is it an astonishing win, but it was you know, and I was just like, I paused and I was like, that is racist. You know, because my sons looked at me and their jaws kind of dropped. And my dad was saying this thing that he thought was funny, and I just was like, I got to do this, you know? And I had not confronted my father that way, and he was stung by it, and he recovered, and it was okay. And so it also gets easier. You know, Claudia Rankin talks about a notion that I think comes from Sarah Schulman, like that conflict is not abuse. And so I think a lot of white people think that they will literally, that their parent would like explode into 1,000 shards if you said, hey, that's some racist stuff you just said. Turns out not so. So maybe calling out people you know and love is even more important, and maybe a way to change this stuff than calling out people who will just yell back at you.
To that point, Patrick, I'm one of 10 children in Louisiana, and we're a big Cajun Creole family, so we're all different colors, all different everything. And the hardest thing I ever had to do was to say to my siblings, because you grew up with it, like, you know, you joke about this and joke about that and say, it's not funny.
Right.
You know, you can't say things like this. You know, that was the hardest thing I've ever had to face.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's an excellent question. I think we have time for one more.
Thank you. My question is about a show that was announced and then I believe quickly canceled called Confederate, which was planned to be about it's a historical fiction on if the South won the Civil War, written by the two white men responsible for Game of Thrones. I believe it was canceled due to the immediate outrage of the internet. But I was wondering, it brought up a conversation about storytelling and what is sort of your limits as a storyteller, what stories you are allowed to tell and what stories you are not. And I was wondering your opinions as storytellers on where that line is.
So many great questions.
That is a great question, yeah.
I mean, well, we can always go, well, why hasn't there been a television show, you know, if Hitler had won? Why can we, you know, that's not even entertainable. I mean, you know, I mean, you wouldn't be able to live in New York if you had sent that query out to your agent or something like that. You know what I mean? You'd have to leave town. So I think part of what's happening is that we are, you know, the people who would have to bear the brunt of this fantasy show still have the, you know, the man's foot on their neck. You know what I mean? It's not tenable at this point. Maybe when we're through with all of this, when you guys and we have all done our work, we can have a show like that. Right now, it would be hard. It would be hard to entertain. And I don't know if canceling anything is the right response. The best response might have been to let it go and then have no viewers. And then what would happen is
lose a bunch of money.
Yeah, lose a bunch of money, and that speaks so loudly. I'm interested in what other people feel.
I've gotten in trouble over this because I believe that we shouldn't put limits on the imagination and let ideas, I have this utopian notion that ideas kind of battle it out and the forces of good always win over the forces of evil. And this is more pertinent because there are certain poets who have written very explicitly about being racist, and I think that's wonderful because now we can hear what it sounds like, and I think it kind of allows people to kind of engage in conversations. If we don't engage in those conversations, that's where I feel like things kind of fester. So I don't know the show. I'm not here in New York, but I'm not sure if shutting it down is the best. You did say, is there limitations to storytelling? I think something like that probably would be a bad story to kind of mount. Then again, we did have Birth of a Nation, which gave us modern film.
That's right.
And considered the best early example of what we understand to be the cinematic experience. That movie, as some of you know, became a recruitment tool for the KKK at the turn of the 20th century. So that's the fear, isn't it? That someone will not see irony or understand the complexity of it, but indeed take it for face value as ideology that they should sign up for.
And I think that for sure would have happened with that show. I mean, I can say, coming from where I come from, that's what would have happened with that show. And yeah, I mean, the Birth of a Nation debuts in 1915. And it isn't just a recruitment tool. It basically creates the second wave Klan. Like the second wave Klan comes into being atop Stone Mountain in Georgia, where I went on every middle school field trip, and no one ever in a million years said anything about any of that history. They never told you anything. But I mean, that's to the point that like storytelling is really powerful. That film, and if you ever have the sense that Hollywood seems kind of racist, that's in the DNA from day one. It's created by a film depicting the story that leads to every lynching practically in the 20th century, the story of savage black men attacking a young white virgin. And so that story is powerful. In terms of your question of what right does one, who can tell what story? I mean, in my earliest notes of writing this book, there's a point where I was writing and then I just stop and it's like return, and it's like, what right do you have? And I stopped, and then there's nothing for like 3 years. I just abandoned the thing because I was like, what right? Like, are you crazy? And so I thought about that constantly, and I think the nudge I got from Natasha was a push to do it and a sense that I had an obligation, and you said this when we were talking earlier, also a sense of kind of license to do it, a bit of like permission. And I think when I finally went ahead was when I accepted that, okay, what this means if you're going to do this with some care and conscientiousness is you're going to go out and interview the descendants of these families. It takes a lot of work to recover the black voices in the story because they're not in the archives. And you're going to get on those airplanes, you're going to rent those cars, you're going to stay in those Hampton Inns, and you're going to talk to those people. And you basically, I had to take on the responsibilities to do it well. So I guess I think anytime you go out on that limb, if you get it wrong, you've probably, it's not just who you are, it's the way in which you did it. Like I finally came to the conclusion, if I wrote a bad book, I'd deserve all the derision heaped on me. And if I wrote a good one, then I could justify getting involved. So.
Well, Sapphire, Major, and Patrick, I mean, we could talk about this forever. And actually, the conversation should continue. You guys have given us a great jumping off point. I want to thank you for joining us here tonight, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks for the great question.
Yeah. And also in particular, I want to thank Cardinal Dolan and the Archdiocese of New York for making the conversations like this possible here. And you all will be signing books? Yes, right. Awesome. So if you want a book signed, they will be outside. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.